Welcome to the last event and panel of today's meeting on Brexit and Ireland. My name is Tony Connelly. I'm the RTE Europe editor in Brussels, also the author of a little-known book called Brexit and Ireland, which is available in all good bookshops at the moment. End of plug. So I would like to welcome to this panel on Brexit and the Island of Ireland conference. This is a panel on the All-Ireland economy and the border question. With us this afternoon we have John Bruton, of course, the former Taoiseach from 1994 to 97. We have Graham Gudgin of the Policy Exchange, Katy Hayward of Queen's University Belfast, and Martina Lawless of the ESRI think tank in Dublin. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Bruton, who is going to talk on the theme. We'll have about 5 minutes for each presenter, then I'll be asking questions, and then finally I'll take questions from the floor. So I hope it's an enjoyable and stimulating conversation. Over to you, John. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We heard earlier this morning that this was a period when relations between Britain and Ireland and between Britain and the European Union had reached a very bad state relative to what they had been for many, many years. And I think it's important that we should recognise that and look at the reasons for it, seek we understand them. I think there is, and I obviously speak from an Irish/EU point of view here, there has been for many years a lack of understanding in the United Kingdom of the nature of the European Union, and indeed of the nature of the sort of international relations that the European Union provides for. The European Union is first and foremost a rules-based organisation. It behaves in accordance with detailed written rules and can't depart from those without going through the procedure, which is often very difficult, of changing those rules. The UK, on the other hand, even though it's been a member of the European Union for 40 years, sees relationships with the rest of the European Union as sort of traditional power-based politics, where you go to Berlin and you go to Paris and things are sorted. And this is partly due also to the fact that different legal traditions. The UK is a common law country where basically you write fairly simple laws which don't cover every eventuality, and you leave it to the judges to sort out what they really meant later. In contrast, in the continental system, which the European Union operates under, you provide for, as near as possible, every eventuality. So many of the differences that are currently occurring and misunderstandings that are occurring about the customs code of the European Union and what it requires and what it means in terms of the various solutions that are being advanced by the British side derive from a failure to understand the nature of the European Union, I think, in this country. What is the European Union? The European Union is a common system for making rules, and making them democratically, by the way, European Parliament and elected Council of Ministers, making rules, a common single system for making rules, a common single system for interpreting those rules, the European Court of Justice, and a common single system for ensuring that those rules are enforced uniformly across all 28 countries. The European Commission and the primacy of EU law over national law. That's essentially what the EU is all about. It's those three things. But I don't think really that British public opinion ever understood that. They have thought instead that, there can be exceptions and special deals and carve-outs and all of that. And indeed, there have been some, because people wanted to accommodate Britain. But a bad habit has developed of thinking that every issue can be finessed, that rules can be set aside, that the European Court of Justice can be set aside or applied selectively, that the European Commission's authority can be set aside selectively. And as we proceed into the negotiations, into the negotiation of the framework, and into the negotiation of the final treaty, these misunderstandings, unless they are faced up to here in London, are going to continue to harm the negotiation. Because the nature of the European Union needs to be understood. Now, it is ironic that, in a way, English public opinion has had to decide to leave the European Union in order to be required to come to understand what the European Union is, but that essentially is what is now going to have to happen if there's to be a happy outcome to this negotiation. Because you cannot postulate a European Union that's different from what the European Union actually is and say, well, we'd prefer to negotiate with a different type of European Union to the one that's there. It's the one that's there that you're trying to leave. And it's the one that's there you have to negotiate with in accordance with the terms that it has set for itself in treaties going back to 1953 or 54 or whenever, when the first of these treaties was negotiated. Now, I think also there is possibly going to be a problem with public opinion here, because in a sense the UK government is saying contradictory things. It's saying, well, should we have more or less the same rules as the EU anyway, so why shouldn't we have complete access to the single market, even though we're opting out of the Court of Justice and therefore the rules could be interpreted differently, even though the EU Commission will have no authority and the rules mightn't be enforced. Sure, we still have the same rules, so can't we stay in? But they're also saying, we're going to take back control and we're going to make our own rules and we're going to change these rules. Well, that means once the UK takes back control of single market type stuff, that nobody will know what the situation is going to be from one year to the next. And one might have a deal that says, okay, there is equivalence, whatever that is, it's a fairly vague term, but there is equivalence at the moment. But something could be done by some ministerial order under some subsidiary legislation which changes something, and suddenly you don't have equivalence. And by the time everyone has realised that this change has been made, you may end up in court, or there may have been actual problems. So I think these issues need to be addressed. Taking back control and maintaining equivalence are contradictions. They're contradictory of one another. And I think the UK needs to decide which is it wants. Equivalence and alignment, or taking back control. You can't have both, I think. I'm happy to be disproven, of course, by now, finally, I have to say, it is important that an English audience should understand that Britain's decision to leave the European Union is deeply hurtful to my country. We decided to join the European Union back in 1972, largely because Britain was doing it. Britain gave the lead, and we and Denmark followed. And we made a democratic decision. We reaffirmed it. It was our own decision. It was a brilliant decision as far as we're concerned. And we made it on the basis that Britain was entering into treaty obligations, not just with the European Union, but with us as another member of the European Union, with Denmark, with France, with all these countries. And this is perhaps the perception of a smaller country as against a bigger country, we see a treaty as like a contract. It was a contract with now has 28 parties. Now, if you enter into a contract to buy a house from somebody, and you signed 40 years ago, or 40 months ago, or 40 days ago, and you say, well, sorry, I want to pull out of that contract now. Well, you more or less expect, I think, if you're drawing from a contract, that you have to make the running as far as satisfying the other side is concerned. That doesn't seem to be the approach with which the negotiation is currently being dealt with here on this side of the Channel. There's a sense that somehow or other it's for the European Union to come up with a solution to help Britain break the contract that it made with us, with Ireland, with Denmark, with France, with all the other countries in the European Union, including the countries that have joined more recently. This is a contractual-based, rule-based arrangement, which the UK is trying to get out of. And I don't think that's fully understood in this country by the government of this country at this stage. But unfortunately, it will be understood by the time the negotiation is over. And it's not going to be an easy road, but the sooner this is internalised in the British public debate, the easier will be the negotiation.
Thank you very much, John. A very passionate expose of how the EU works. I'm just wondering if that sense of the British public or the British population or the British system, if they had perhaps fully understood the way the EU works or the nature of the EU as you describe it and explain it, if that understanding had been there in greater depth, according to your logic at least, would the result have been any different 2 years ago? But that's a question for another day.
There wouldn't have been a referendum.
There wouldn't have been a referendum to start with. Okay, I'd like now to introduce Martina Lawless from the ESRI. Martina is going to set out her analysis on the likely economic effect of Brexit on the Republic of Ireland. Now, obviously, the Irish question is more commonly linked to the Irish border, but of course there is €65 billion in trade both ways between Ireland and Great Britain and the United Kingdom each year, and that is a major skin in the game that the Irish government has. Thanks, Martina.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much for having me here today. Like Taoiseach, I want to look back just for a moment at some of what explains the difference between how Ireland views the EU and how the UK perhaps views it, which is that when Ireland joined the European Economic Community as it was then in 1973, it was actually a very poor country. The average GDP per capita was about 60% of the EU average at the time. The UK was joining on an equal basis with all of these other member states. Ireland was joining as a poor country. It was joining a large market. And one of the things that has happened in Ireland over the past 40 years is that its outward orientation, increase in free trade, openness to foreign direct investment, primarily from US multinationals that have used Ireland as a base to gain access to the wider European market, has resulted in an enormous catch-up of the Irish economy, to the extent that it's now well in excess of the European average in GDP per capita terms. And really, from the Irish perspective, membership of the EU is credited with playing a key role in that economic transformation. And it's one of the reasons you see a very positive view of the European Union from the Irish perspective. Now, at the same time, when Ireland joined in 1973, its biggest economic partner, accounting for almost 3/4 of its trade, was the United Kingdom. When the UK applied to join in the 1960s and its membership application was vetoed, Ireland immediately withdrew its own application for membership of the European Union because joining without the UK was not in Ireland's interest. Now, since then, because Ireland has diversified, its markets within Europe and with the US have continued to grow, the role of the UK as an economic partner has sort of declined in relative importance. So it's no longer accounting for the vast majority of Ireland's trade and investment as it once did. At the same time, it does remain one of the most important trading partners. So exports from Ireland, 14% of them of goods go to the UK. Almost 1/4 of Irish goods imports come from the UK because the whole retail and wholesale markets are incredibly tightly aligned. So there's still a big economic exposure. And the referendum on Brexit was followed with enormous detail from Ireland, and the idea that the UK was leaving the common market, potentially leaving the customs union, posed a very strong kind of concern. It's probably the number one policy issue in Ireland at the moment, is what does this mean for Ireland, both obviously in terms of the border issue, but even sort of abstracting from that on a pure economic level, what will disruption to trade patterns between one of our biggest trading partners mean for the Irish economy? So obviously in the longer run, everybody will hope that there's be a continued very close trading partner, a free trade agreement of some sort between the EU and the UK. Obviously, at an EU level, trade is an EU prerogative, so Ireland cannot separately negotiate a bespoke deal with the UK, no matter how important an economic partner that is to us. This is going to be done at an EU level. But Ireland's going to be an important partner there. And when you look at the analysis of how different scenarios of Brexit and different possible replacement sort of trade deals, whether they be EEA-EFTA deals or the more extreme move to sort of WTO level tariffs would have on different member states. What comes out consistently is that Ireland is the most exposed to negative impacts of disruptions to trade between the EU and the UK of all of the member states. So if you look at something like the kind of perhaps the most extreme scenario, which is a move to WTO level tariffs, On average, those tariffs, as they would be kind of negotiated on a product-by-product basis for the EU, would be about 5%. For Irish trade with the UK, they'd be over 11%. As a result, the potential impact on Irish trade patterns would be about twice as high a reduction as it would be for overall EU-UK trade. And there's two reasons for that. One is that Ireland trades more with the UK than most of the other member states as a proportion of its economy. But the second reason is that the composition of that trade is quite different. If you actually look at the WTO-style tariffs, what you see is that they're actually very low. The EU has a very open to trade position internationally on lots of goods exports. There's lots of 0% tariffs on pharmaceuticals and other products. And then you have agriculture and food tariffs, which are extremely high. And when you look at the patterns of trade between Ireland and the UK, you see a very high percentage of that trade is in agriculture and food. Much higher, in fact, than Ireland's trade with the world in general, because a lot of Ireland's trade with the broader global economy is in products coming from the foreign multinational sector, the pharmaceuticals and chemicals sector, which aren't particularly exposed to tariffs. Whereas a lot of the trade with the UK is coming from smaller, Irish-owned, largely SME-type businesses, and they're much more predominantly in the food sector. So that leaves, first of all, a larger negative trade impact on Ireland than of any other member states, and it also has impacts on the type of the distribution of those effects. As I said, within Ireland, the negative trade effects would be largely spread in more rural regions, on Irish-owned SMEs, on more employment-intensive sectors. So there's actually a sort of potentially larger effect than those headline GDP numbers would give you a sense of. In addition, on the import side, with great concerns that the UK is one of the most important importing partners. The retail, wholesale sectors are very tightly integrated, so there's an immediate risk of a serious impact on Irish consumer prices if all those tariffs or increased trading costs or potential cost delays and so on get passed on to consumers. So one of the estimates that we would have there would be that trade barriers could pretty much immediately result in increased consumer prices of about 2 to 3%, which is pretty significant. But also, again, that the distributional aspect is important. A lot of what's imported from the UK and the products where you would have the largest price increases, again, are largely food because of the structure of the tariffs and where delays are most costly, and that then falls disproportionately on lower income households because they spend more of their income on food. So similar analysis from the UK found something exactly the same, that in the event of any negative impacts of trade or price increases, there's a disproportionate impact on poorer households where food is a more important element of their basket of goods. At the same time, a lot of the discussion today has been that perhaps these WTO tariffs are a very extreme scenario. Everybody ideally would like to avoid them and to negotiate a very wide-ranging, hopefully quite comprehensive trade deal for goods. But that doesn't get around the fact that if the UK is out of the customs union and checks and administration documents have to be filled in, there is a cost to businesses in doing that. And I think in the longer run, these increased costs in terms of administration and time and potential delays in terms of supply chains and so on could actually be the bigger impact. So previous work I'd done, and this was actually long before Brexit and unrelated to this, show that the administrative complexity, which the World Bank measured as the number of documents you need to fill in when crossing an international border and the number of hours it takes you to fill those in. A 10% increase in the time or the number of documents reduces trade by about 6%. And this effect actually, it has sort of different effects on different types of firms, because filling in your customs form, complying with your regulations, doing the checks, registering your business, becoming a trusted trader, whatever, you have to do that no matter how big the load is that you're trying to trade. So again, there's differential effects across different types of businesses, and here where you see the burden disproportionately fall is on smaller traders that would be trying to trade relatively small amounts. which is very much the pattern of trade across the Irish border. Relatively small businesses doing lots of deliveries back and forth on a daily basis. So this sort of fixed cost element, the cost unrelated to the size or the value of the shipment, has a disproportionately negative effect on smaller firms. Similar results from the US-Canada border, which again, part of a free trade agreement. One of the examples that's often been used of a low friction, if not obviously frictionless border, is that adds about 2.7% to the cost of every sort of value of merchandise trade. So those customs delays are really a central concern for Irish business, both obviously in terms of what they mean for the border, but also for other Irish businesses selling into the UK, and not just selling into the UK, because one of the real causes of concern for Irish business and for Irish policymakers is that Irish trade to the rest of the world uses the UK as a land bridge for a lot of its transportation. This was mentioned briefly early on. And this is potentially a very significant cost. About roughly half of Irish trade to the rest of the world gets transported through the UK. So delays at Holyhead, delays at Dover, all adds negatively to potential Irish trade flows, not just on the Irish-UK trade, but on Irish trade internationally. This is a very sort of serious and high-level issue, and there's been a lot of talk about what technology can do for the Irish border, but there's also a real importance for getting technological and getting ease of access through all of the other ports in the UK and in Ireland to facilitate any changes in trading structure that would go on there. So I know Graham's probably going to talk about technological solutions a little bit more detail. But while these kind of technological solutions and trusted traders, they may help to minimize these costs, but it's hard to see a scenario in which having to fill in any new amount of documentation, having to have any level of increased checks, rules of origin, documentation, if your trade deals are done with the wider world, will avoid having some extra costs to businesses. And it's also difficult to see how these can be up and running in the very, very short amount of time that's left between now and the end of the transition period. And certainly anybody here who's ever been involved in a large IT project will know that these things very, very rarely run to time, or to budget indeed. And there doesn't seem to be any active planning for those kind of facilitation of broader trade, which I think is a big concern. So I think I'm out of time, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martina. A very granular look at the impact of Brexit on the Irish Republic economy. I mean, one point you raised there about the UK as land bridge. I mean, there was some speculation that when Irish trucks cross over to the UK to use the land bridge, would there be a scenario where Irish trucks might be fast-tracked at Dover because they shouldn't be allowed they shouldn't have to do the long tailback. So I can just imagine how an Irish fast track would go down with British truckers. So you mentioned there technology, and of course technology, or option B as we might call it, has really come into the debate. Up to a few weeks ago, MaxFac was shorthand for a cosmetics firm. Now it's part of the debate and part of the narrative over how to solve the Irish border question, and it's a very controversial issue. We've heard some comments today about how much infrastructure might be tolerated, how intrusive would that infrastructure be, what would the attitude of Catholics or people in Northern Ireland be towards that infrastructure, and what role will it play in the negotiations. And here to give us more detail on that is Graham Gudgin from the Policy Exchange. I'll hand it over to you, Graham. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Perhaps also to mention that I used to be in a former life the Special Advisor to the First Minister in Northern Ireland, which is what gives me it's partly what gives me my knowledge of Northern Ireland. I still have a house there and go back to Northern Ireland as often as I can. Just before I start on my own remarks, can I just say I agree with what John Bruton said. I think the different legal systems and the different ways of negotiating are a real problem here, and the British haven't traditionally understood of that difference. That's quite right. And also I agree that the UK can't count on continually getting exemptions as it has in the past, that Theresa May doesn't quite wield the same handbag as Margaret Thatcher used to on that. So I draw a different conclusion, because it seems to me that that's one of the key reasons that Brexiteers like myself put forward for getting out. Look, we don't fit in. We are a square peg in a round hole. And best to leave now as the UK heads fitfully and slowly, but definitely towards the United States of Europe. We'll always be asking for exemptions, and it's not a good way to operate. I agree with John on that. I also agree with what a number of people have said, and I think John implied that Ireland wasn't at the forefront, or indeed perhaps even at the back of people's minds when they were voting in the referendum. But I think it's fair to say, it's worth saying in this context, that the UK, I think, has tried very hard since the referendum to make sure that Ireland isn't going to suffer out of this. Indeed, the UK has done much more to argue for the free trade agreement that Ireland so badly needs than Dublin has. And it's one of those strange things to me, in anything that comes out of the Irish government in Dublin never mentions free trade, and yet it's essential, getting this free trade agreement. Essential for Ireland, good for the UK as well, good for everybody actually. Right, to come to what I intended to say, I'm always a touch amused when I go back to Northern Ireland, and I say do that as often as I possibly can, to be told that, of course, Northern Ireland didn't vote for Brexit, 56% voted Remain. And I always think, well, gosh, I've just come from Cambridge via London, 76% voting for Remain. 56 doesn't sound all that overwhelming. But Northern Ireland is the one part of the UK that doesn't have to leave the EU if it doesn't want to, because it has a constitutional right to have a referendum to stay, to join a united Ireland, and therefore implicitly to stay in the UK, in the EU. Cambridge can't do that. London can't do that. Even Scotland and Wales are not in the same position. But I think, as we've seen from the various polling results over the day, that support for United Ireland, and therefore for actually staying in the EU, hasn't risen at all since the Brexit referendum. About 4-1 majority for staying in the UK. And we also, as Lord Bew was saying earlier, I mean, we've had a recent general election to test people's opinions on this. And in that general election, the DUP vote rose by a whacking 10 percentage points. Amazing. As Paul Bew said, nobody expected that, least of all the DUP themselves. DUP, of course, were pro-Brexit, although, as has been pointed out, not all of the people who voted for the DUP are necessarily pro-Brexit, but then that's the way these things go in elections. And at the same time, the pro-Remain Ulster Unionist Party, the UUP, their vote fell by a third. Now, this tells us quite a lot. I mean, it may be that people would prefer, perhaps there wasn't a referendum, or prefer the UK wasn't leaving the EU. But when it comes to the hard choices, look, are you going to go with the UK or not? It's clear what the result is. Now, I think it's not surprising that the majority in Northern Ireland voted Remain. Partly, of course, it was a nationalist unionist split, as in almost any vote in Northern Ireland. But it's also what people have been told. I mean, that they were told even more strongly, I think, than people in GB, that Brexit was going to be an economic disaster. And they're continually told that there'll be problems on the border. The British government repeats time after time, there will be no hard border. And they clarify that by saying there will be no new infrastructure on the border. And yet people are continually asked, as in the poll we were talking about, was being talked about earlier today, asked about what would be your reaction to having soldiers on the border. Good heavens, look, it's absolutely not in the agenda at all. And yet these things are put into the public domain all the time. Nobody's going to be stopped at the border. The likelihood is that no trucks are going to be stopped at the border. It's really somewhat hard to see quite what the issue is here. Of course, there are other issues, and I could talk about that if I had time. Northern Ireland is an integral part of the wider UK economy, and as a first approximation, any economic changes in the UK economy are largely reproduced in Northern Ireland. Therefore, the big question is what happens to the UK after Brexit. And this is something that colleagues, myself and colleagues at Cambridge and at Ulster University in Northern Ireland have looked at in perhaps more detail than anybody else. I mean, we completely replicated the Treasury's analysis on this. And we find huge flaws in that analysis, always on the same side, always exaggerating the negative effects. We've been unable to talk to the Treasury about this. They won't discuss it. The Financial Times won't take any letters on this. And yet, rather shockingly, about 3 weeks ago, the economics editor of the Financial Times finally said, oh yes, the long-term forecasts of the Treasury are rather extreme. But, and I quote here, but the Treasury had a referendum to win. Now, I find that really rather shocking because it supports Michael Gove's view on this, that you can't trust these organisations with acronyms. And the OECD and the IMF use rather similar methods with similar flaws. When we do this ourselves, we think there will be a small decrease in GDP, but probably no decrease whatsoever in per capita GDP. That's the measure of our living standards. Probably not, won't go up, won't go down. Not much difference at all. I think the main impact on Northern Ireland won't be on the wider economy. It'll be on the access to labour, to cheap labour, which is very important, particularly in food processing in Northern Ireland. And this is really at the heart of the Brexit debate nationally. For instance, it's not generally publicised that UK has created 4 million new jobs over the last 12, 15 years. And that 3 million of those, 3/4, have gone to people who weren't born in the UK. And at the same time, the amount of money spent on training by UK companies has halved. So what's been happening is our companies have had access to good quality labour, people with good work ethics, willing to work work hard at minimum wage. And not surprisingly, they've chosen to employ them and not to spend money on training their own labour force. Hilary Benn did the usual politician thing, say, oh, terrible, we can't get enough doctors and nurses for the EU and they're making difficulty letting these people into the UK. He didn't say a word, of course, about cutting training budgets for nurses or for doctors in the UK. In my view, and this is one of my key reasons for voting Brexit in the first place, we need a very different business model for the UK. And I'm sorry, as many people are, that this is upsetting for Ireland and may cause problems. But I think we all support the efforts of the UK government to do as much as they can to mitigate and soften those effects. Final thing I want to say is that, and it's really a response to Martina's point about long waits at borders. And my argument is that an Irish border without physical infrastructure, nothing at all, is fully attainable, even without cameras. And of course the danger here is not of a widespread return to violence in Northern Ireland, but the fact that some dissidents, with, as Gerry Adams keeps repeating, with minimal support in the community in Northern Ireland, but that nevertheless they'll spend time shooting up cameras and may take pot shots at police or other people who have to maintain the cameras. What can be done is I think a complex customs partnership of the sort that Theresa May seems to want is unnecessary. Arrangements based on the UK's proposal for an expanded trusted trader scheme and exemptions for small traders will suffice to operate a border. And it's quite possible to operate a border without cameras. You don't need to take my word for this. This is the view of Lars Carlson, who's the EU's own expert on this. former head of the World Customs Association and more recently Deputy Director of Swedish Customs. He said this in Hilary Benn's committee, by the way, but if you look at the reports of that evidence, let's say it doesn't get much prominence. Carlson said, yeah, look, quite possible to have borders without, even without cameras. It's quite true, as many people say, that you can't find a border, an existing border, anywhere in the EU or anywhere else without some sort of infrastructure. But that's exactly Carlson's point. Carlson is obviously a sort of technophile, and he'd really like to see new technology, which is really based on mobile phones and GPSs in cabs. And he'd like to see that in Northern Ireland, not only for Northern Ireland's sake, but his argument is that this would be a model for the future for all borders around the EU. Technology isn't new. We keep hearing that, gosh, the technology isn't there, it would take years to put it. Technology is in my pocket, it's in your pocket. Your phone knows where you are at this moment. It also knows when you're approaching a border. It'll switch you over to another provider in whatever country you're moving into. This is technology that's already used by Network Rail. Network Rail has already started to replace all its physical signalling by mobile phone technology in the cabs. And if that works for trains that are thundering along tracks at 125 miles an hour, 2 minutes apart, it's surely possible for trucks on the island of Ireland. It's also used on the underground. The Victoria line, which to me I use quite a bit, and I think is one of the wonders of modern technology, with trains running about a minute apart, uses that technology. Uber and nearly all taxi firms use similar technology. What exactly is the problem here? Just need to set up a control room and make sure that all HGVs carry such technology. And by the way, there are only about 6,000 HGVs cross the Irish border each day in both directions, and half of them are on one road. This really isn't a big deal by international standards. So, my conclusion, this is in the policy exchange report that Owen Patterson mentioned so generously this morning, much to the annoyance of organisers here, I think, that the promise of a hard border, promise of avoiding no hard border in Ireland can be delivered, and it can be done without remaining in the customs union or inventing new and complex schemes for tracking individual consignments to their final destinations. Since very few consignments are actually changed, about 1% coming into Ireland from outside the EU, and these checks are nearly always based on intelligence, in which case you don't need to stop them at the border, you can stop them anywhere if you have intelligence about drugs in containers. My very last point, I was in the port of Bristol a couple of weeks ago, and we were told that only 2 containers in the whole port of Bristol were opened last year, and in both cases based on intelligence. This really isn't the problem that it's made out to be, but I leave it to others to explain why the problem has been exaggerated to the extent it has. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Graham. Thought-provoking intervention there from Graham, and discussion on, I suppose, the politics of Brexit in Northern Ireland and the technical aspects of borders and infrastructure and checks. And I'm sure our next speaker, Katy Hayward from Queen's University Belfast, will have a few ripostes to Graham's speech. I'd like to hand over the floor now to Katy Hayward. Thanks, Katy.
Thank you, Tony. I'm going to talk about technology, because we've heard a lot about it and I've done quite a lot of research on it. First, I want to begin with an anecdote from a focus group I conducted last week on the Donegal Fermanagh border. And we asked about automatic number plate recognition cameras. And we said, what would you think about this? And somebody said, oh yes, I remember they put one up a few years back on the border there. Within a few hours, Jimmy had run into it with his tractor. He said, we never knew whether it was by accident or on purpose, but they never put up that ANPR camera again. I'm going to try and begin by addressing the title of the panel, which is specifically about the border question and the all-island economy. And I think a big problem has been that the border question has been subsumed into that of the all-island economy, and this has been touched on already. This, of course, wasn't the intention of the European Union. In putting the protocol forward, it was very much concentrating on North-South, the Good Friday Agreement, etc. Nor, of course, was it the intention of the UK, which has somewhat feigned surprise at the existence of the phrase all-island economy as being something that needs to be protected through full alignment if such a scenario was to emerge. Let's remember what's already been agreed in the protocol of the draft withdrawal agreement. This is bilateral arrangements, common travel area in particular, the existence of a specialised committee for Northern Ireland relating to the EU, which would be fascinating. North-South cooperation is in green. We don't know the details of it, but it's already been agreed in text and in principle. What hasn't been agreed? Customs territory for Northern Ireland, and the common regulatory area, the customs union and the single market. So why is there this block to progress in that particular issue? Unfortunately, I think it still comes down to that point about having different interpretations of what was meant in that commitment to avoid a hard border. So if we look at it from the UK's position, what is it put forward to varying degrees of clarity or vagueness in relation to how that hard border might yet be avoided? Well, we've got the NCP, the New Customs Partnership, which is essentially dealing with a complicated problem by making it much more complicated, as far as I can see, which is generally the forte of academics rather than politicians. But anyway, that's a new customs partnership. Then we have the alternative backstop, which is basically to deal with this complicated problem by putting it on the long finger, but actually not dealing with it at all. And then thirdly, we have MaxFac, maximum facilitation, which is exactly what it says on the tin. It is to facilitate a hard border, in effect, and make it possible to have border controls that are more efficient, but also more surreptitious. So I want to bring us back to basics first and foremost and think, well, what does a customs border mean? We concentrate a lot on rules of origin, on tariffs, etc. What does it mean for people, and what does it mean for businesses? Why don't they like customs? That's a genuinely straightforward question to ask. But if you ask people and businesses, they say they don't like the uncertainty with it. They don't like the costs, as Martina has already outlined. They don't like the delays. They don't like the administrative burden. What can technology do to deal with all of this? It can do quite a lot. First and foremost, it can speed things up. You can have advanced clearance. You can have paperless declarations in advance. And the reason why we have the Union Customs Code, the creation of an e-customs system in the EU, and why we're having the development of the CDS, the Customs Declaration Service in the UK, is recognising the value that comes about through having these facilities. They're complicated IT systems. They need to be interconnected. They need to communicate. They take a long time to set up. The second promise of technology, which is a genuine promise that it can deliver on, is to reduce the scope for fraud. Blockchain, if you wish, can be used, is starting to be used in relation to certificates of origin. It makes it less easy, almost impossible in certain cases, to tamper with what's being put on the paper, what the certificate of origin says. A third way in which technology can help, it can detect unplanned movements or unexpected movements. You can have sensors, you can have them on the ground, you can have them in the air in drones if you like. They can tell you at great distances and in some detail that something's crossing the border and maybe you hadn't expected to be crossing it. And then fourthly, it can reduce intrusive checks. You can have all types of machines that look inside of containers. They use gamma rays, they use vapor spectroscopy. They can tell you the volume, they can tell you if there's things that are possibly in there that you wouldn't have expected to be in there. They're very specific. They work for specific types of chemicals or contraband for specific purposes. You can't have one machine that does scans for everything. More to the point, they're very costly and they take a long time to do their job. What is the problem in the Irish case, specifically on those terms, if you take the terms of technology? I'm going to take them on all 4 points. The first point about paperless customs, based on advanced clearance, based on information. A genuine question, What happens if somebody isn't a registered trader? What happens if they just forgot? Or if they decided deliberately to forget or not to become registered? There are notorious smugglers in the Irish border region. Who's going to go to them and say, excuse me, I think you forgot to register as a trusted trader? More particularly, these processes, these IT systems take a long time. The UCC is taking a long time to emerge. It takes elaboration. You need the proper legislation. You need the business modelling. It takes time to construct these systems, make sure they communicate with one another. And of course, you need the training and the communication involved in the rollout of these things. A second promise, dealing with fraud. A hard border increases the incentive for smuggling. We've seen this in the past. Now, without being too crude or cliched about it, what militarised watchtowers, what army checkpoints, what block roads, what cratered roads, what dragon's teeth across country roads couldn't prevent, blockchain can't prevent. Thirdly, detection. Surveillance comes into this a lot about intelligence, a lot about surveillance. This is as redundant as it is offensive. And I'm saying it is offensive because I would like to just suggest that if we had this type of surveillance, mobile phone tracking, drones surveying vehicles in Dover or Folkestone or Holyhead, people would rightly object. And I will raise a point that was raised to me by a 16-year-old in Monaghan when I mentioned about this type of tracking as a means of having an invisible border. And she said, data protection. Privacy, we have rights in relation to these things. We can't be moving, this can't be seen as a matter of progress. And secondly, on the point of detection, it is also redundant. This technology works in inhospitable, unpopulated plains where you do not expect to see a vehicle or a person crossing the border. This is not the nature of the Irish border. It is crisscrossed with roads, it is straddled with farms, it's straddled with households and with parishes. You can't use that type of technology on these type of places. More particularly, how will you know what crossing is illegal or unexpected? And then fourthly, the point about checks. Leaving aside the limitations, severe limitations of this technology, you will still need human follow-up. Customs relies on, efficiency relies on being able to say, you will have a human, probably with a sniffer dog, able to inspect the contents of those containers. You have something dodgy flagged up. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to pull them onto the side of the road and pull out the contents onto the road, have all the delays that would entail? Or maybe you'll direct them to a warehouse. That will need proper facilities. It's not going to be invisible by any means. The further away it is from the border, the more likely it is to be useless as a point of inspection because you'll have that grey space in between where things can somehow disappear. Or maybe you'll wait until it's on the shelves, by which time the contraband, the stuff that you didn't want on the shelves, is already gone out of the shops. Who's going to do that inspection in the shops when it's on the shelves? So in sum, this is not an answer. The longer this goes on as a potential answer, the more uncertainty there is. And this is having an impact already in the border, already on businesses, already on families. I can't believe that I'm still saying this at this stage. We need to be clear about what a hard border means and why it must be avoided. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katy. I'd like to take some questions from the floor shortly, but I can't resist the temptation now that John Bruton is here, a former Taoiseach. I wanted to ask him about this narrative that has, I suppose, taken root in Westminster about Leo Varadkar being a somewhat inexperienced Taoiseach, overplaying his hand in these Brexit negotiations, perhaps worried about the threat of Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil. As a former Taoiseach, as a former Fine Gael Taoiseach, you would know him. What do you make of that particular narrative?
I think the narrative is being advanced by people who are somewhat surprised that an Irish government is prepared to take a firm stand in defence of its own interests, the interests of its own people, and the protection of the terms of an international treaty that it entered into with the UK in the form of the Good Friday Agreement and indeed in the form of our common EU membership. We have had a very easy time in Anglo-Irish relations for quite some time, where essentially the two governments were on the same side, first in their opposition to terrorism and secondly in their promotion of a new dispensation for Northern Ireland. Suddenly we find we're on different sides. And instead of dealing with the issues, and there are real difficult issues which we've already heard referred to here, people in Westminster are inclined to personalise it. And personalising things, caricaturing issues, is much easier. It doesn't require an awful lot of intellectual effort to caricature Leo Varadkar or to caricature any individual. And I think that's what's going on here. The negotiations are reaching the really difficult point now. Leo Varadkar has only recently come into office, so it is his good or bad fortune to be the Taoiseach in office who has to do the hard work of telling the UK some things that some in the UK don't want to hear. That's all that's happened.
Thank you, John. Graham Gudgin, like to respond to that?
I'd just like to ask John, if I may, what he thinks of the widespread belief in GB that there was a distinct hardening of Irish policy between the first half of 2017 under Enda Kenny and a contrast then in the period since the middle of 2017 under Leo Varadkar. Several things happened. One was that ongoing work in the Republic on an electronic border was stopped. The unit was disbanded by Leo Varadkar, I think. The quiet meetings that were occurring between civil servants in Northern Ireland and the Republic were again all stopped. And my belief is that Arlene Foster was being kept informed of what was happening between the Irish and the EU in a much more fulsome way than has happened under Leo Varadkar. And that happened even though that Arlene Foster and Leo Varadkar were quite close friends. They'd both been tourism ministers and they'd been on various trips together. So there's a degree of sort of suspicion about this. Why would the Irish government do this? I think there was a calculation that they could push the Brits into staying in the customs union. And my goodness, that seems to have almost worked.
Well, we shouldn't apologise for wanting to push the UK to stay in the single market and the customs union, because that's what we want the UK to do. That's what's in our interests. You shouldn't be surprised. We're a sovereign country. We'll pursue our own interests, and we will make it as difficult as possible for you to do things that are against our interests.
Are you surprised about what Are you surprised about Enda Kenny's approach to this, then, if you're not surprised about Leo Varadkar's?
I just think that, forgive me being so forceful, I have great time and admiration for Graham, by the way, and he's asking good questions. But the truth is that I think Enda Kenny wasn't in office at the time the really critical issues were reached. When he was there was a sort of a scoping exercise going on. We're now at the point where really difficult decisions have to be taken here in London about the sort of Brexit you have asked for or are going to ask for. And that's the problem is here. I think there is a need for the UK and the people of the UK to take full responsibility for what they're looking for and to spell it out in detail. And that hasn't yet happened. Obviously, if there are easy technical solutions, we're as tech-savvy and as technophile as anybody, and we want easy solutions rather than difficult solutions. We're not going to be difficult for the sake of being difficult. But Brexit is a British idea. Leaving the customs union is a British idea. Leaving the single market is a British idea. Having a frictionless border is a British commitment. Having a Good Friday Agreement with us is a British commitment. And it is for Britain, which is the initiator of Brexit, to come up with solutions first. And when Britain comes up with solutions that seem not to be just negotiating ploys, but a genuine effort to meet the EU's problems. And in any negotiation, the first thing you do is try to understand what are the needs of the person on the other side of the table, and how can you use his wagon to get your hay to market, so to speak. And that hasn't yet happened, I fear.
Thanks very much, John. I would like to take some questions from the floor. If you can stand up and say who you are and which organisation you're from. Gentleman with the green tie there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Mulqueen from the University of Central Lancashire. If I could address Graham, please, without wishing to diminish the possibilities of technology, I suppose just to inject some sobriety into its limitations, notwithstanding daily innovation. An analogy that strikes me as useful in this space is technology used here in the UK by the police service to locate missing persons at high risk. The definition of high risk being under ECHR Article 2 and a real and immediate threat to life. Now, in those circumstances, under the regulatory, under RIPA, to shorten it, a police officer of the rank of superintendent or higher is enabled to undertake what we call telecoms work, to locate a person or persons who that officer believes is at real and immediate risk to life. Now, the public in that context may well believe that telecoms work, so authorised, involves really precise, very reliable and fast-working technology. Very often in practice, what happens is...
Sorry, can we get to the question? Because we're going to run out of time here.
I got it. Very often in practice, what happens is that the technology concerned enables officers to get within to maybe 1/3 of a mile of the person that they are, persons that they're looking for. Now, you know, in an urban environment, in criminal capacity, or even in a rural environment in criminal capacity, 1/3 of a mile does leave, as a general measure, does leave an awful lot of scope for people getting through borders. Second bit, if I may, Tony, just very briefly, and it's just if Graham could comment on, I suppose, or reflect on comments from PSNI's Deputy Chief Constable Drew Harris recently, when he said any infrastructures along the border would give terror groups, quote, a further rallying call to drive their recruitment, unquote. Thank you.
Thank you for injecting a note of... Sorry, thank you for injecting a note of sobriety into this, but I assure you all I'm drinking his water. Yeah, but that's... 2 points there. Firstly, about sort of inducing... increasing membership of dissident paramilitary organisations in Northern Ireland. Suzanne Breen, who's a Northern Ireland journalist that many of you will know, with very good contacts with the Republicans, say that dissident numbers are growing, but she's certain this has got nothing whatsoever to do with Brexit. But on the other hand, all the fuss that's made about cameras and things that are already at the border and things that are already happening at the border but giving them higher salience, I think probably does mean that any dissident worth his salt is going to have a go at the cameras, you know, otherwise he'll get laughed out in the pub. So those things are going to happen. But the idea that cameras would be shot up, and more importantly that the people maintaining them will be shot at, is I think the key reason why the UK government has promised no new infrastructure at all, and why ideas of having mobile technology and GPS actually in the cabs of lorries, nothing on the ground at all, is much more important. And just to answer Katy's point while we're on that, you know, how do you stop people slipping across the border? Well, I think really to make this work, you're probably going to have to legislate to say that all trucks, all HGVs, perhaps even vans as well, are going to have to carry this technology. But then probably most of them do already. A lot of these trucks are worth $250,000 each. You know, the firms are going to want to know where they are as well as the customs authority. And if they all have the technology, then you know who's crossing the border. And if a truck is spotted crossing the border and doesn't show up on the system, then you probably know something's wrong. Were you referring to tagging when you were talking about missing persons? Sorry, was that?
I think you made reference in your delivery to mobile phone technology.
Yes.
Trying to expose some limitations of mobile phone technology. I think what you're also talking about is based on telematics, which is a different technology.
Well, I don't know. Carlson was talking about mobile phones in lorries. He's the expert. I have no engineering knowledge on this. I'm just a mere economist, I'm afraid. But as you're perhaps talking about tagging individuals and police losing. But you were talking to only being accurate to within a third of a mile. But that's clearly not the case. I think if the Victoria line is using this already, the East Coast line, main line, just been renationalised, is also starting to look at it again. As I said in my presentation, if you've got trains moving the East Coast line at 125 miles an hour, 2 minutes apart, you have to know exactly where they are. A third of a mile is no good to you. Technology is much better, I think, than you suggest.
Okay, thanks, Graham. I mean, I suppose that it is worth making the point that, and Leo Varadkar makes the point often as well, that the Irish border is not just about customs, it's about the single market and sanitary and phytosanitary checks, and those may face limitations in terms of checking what is in a truck in terms of food safety and food products and animal products. Eitan, I think you have a question. Yep.
It's just on the contrast between Varadkar and Kenny, just to, I suppose, defend former Taoiseach Bruton's statement. I think that's too black and white because, in fact, towards the end of Charlie O'Flanagan's role as Foreign Minister, he was beginning to criticise the British government quite explicitly for not engaging. And I think it ties in with the argument that as things proceeded, British government's response was increasingly incoherent and not engaging. So I don't think it's to do with which Taoiseach was in power. It's to do with what happened in the negotiations. So it's a comment, I'm sorry, not a question.
Okay, thanks. Have we time for one more question? No? Okay, we don't have time for any more questions, I'm afraid. Anyway, thanks very much to everybody for a fantastic debate and discussion. We are heading into a fairly critical phase. The British government is going to put forward its customs proposal in the next few weeks, and based on whether the Irish government and the EU agree with that proposal, we are heading into a crisis in June, and after that, who knows? Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you all. Don't worry, you can get to enjoy the sunshine in about 30 seconds. I'm going to be very, very quick. I just want to basically wrap things up. Gerald Angley from the Embassy said earlier on today, it's no coincidence that this conference is being held today. Well, full disclosure, it is an absolute coincidence that we managed to schedule this conference for a time when the negotiations are where they are. We're very glad that we did so, but we can claim no special foresight in this. This is just very, very good fortune for us. Secondly, John Bruton said something very, very interesting. Well, he said several very interesting things, but one of the things I found really interesting was him saying that actually Brexit is what it will take to teach the British what EU membership means. And actually Brexit is teaching us a lot in this country. It's teaching us about our politics, our economy. It's taught a lot of people in this country about that we have a place called Northern Ireland that has special status that we were unaware of before. But my point here is Brexit, however it unfolds, is going to imply a redefining of a lot of things in this country. And this takes me back to what I was saying this morning, and I know I bang on about this. It is better to do this based on evidence than not. Now, as we've just seen on this panel, you can disagree about what the evidence says. That's absolutely fine. But let me just reiterate what I started the day saying. What we want to do is inject some research-based knowledge into this debate. And my God, if there was a debate that needed it, it is this one. So I do hope you will follow our work. As I said this morning, 6th of June, we've got Philip Rycroft from DexU coming. I think the Eventbrite link goes live tomorrow. And one final thing, Hilary Benn, as he always does, thanked me for this event and how well it ran. I love being thanked for things I have no hand in whatsoever, so that was great. But actually, this had nothing to do with me. It was all to do with the team who put this together. So I just want to record my thanks to Phoebe, to Lizzie, to Ben, to Nav, and to Matt for putting an enormous... I mean, things like this require an enormous amount of work. And last but not least, he's going to hate me for this, Alan's sitting there. End of last week, I suspected we'd have to buy Alan a team defibrillator. He was so stressed about the state of this conference. But I'd just like to say, Alan, it's been brilliant. Thank you. Thank you all very much indeed, and we'll see you again soon.